So, good evening to everybody, dear colleagues. We are starting our traditional webinar of the Forum of the Friends of European Russia, and this is what we call Russian Dialogues. And this time we shall devote 1 hour webinar to, of course, most important topic, to 2021 legislative elections, so-called elections in Russia. We are not using the word elections, but we do not know how to call what was happening during the last weekend. And my name is Andrius Kubilius. I'm a member of European Parliament and also founder of this forum and hosting also those seminars. Today we shall have really prominent speakers, which are very well known without any big introduction. Vladimir MILOV, Vladimir Kara-Murza. We hope that Konstantin EGGERT also will join us a little bit later. And of course, our major topic is really to listen to prominent experts of and real political people from Russia about the evaluation what has happened with so-called elections, what are the conclusions, what is the future, what Russian opposition people would expect from the Western community, and just for as introductory words, I would say that if you know, last week also in European Parliament we passed Russia report, so-called Russia report. I was leading the group of rapporteurs who prepared that report and who spoke about what kind of EU relations we would like towards Russia we would like to see, what kind of recommendations. One of the recommendations was very clear that the EU needs to be ready not to recognize Duma elections as legitimate ones if really democratic standards, democratic conditions will not be met. And of course, what was happening not only during weekend when the voting was happening, but what was happening before, with arrest of Alexei Navalny, with prohibition of almost 100 independent candidates or opposition candidates to be registered, with persecution or pressure, persecution of free media, even prohibition to use terminology of smart voting. Of course, 3 days voting, and in some cases somewhere on the beach of lakes, as it was said, and also not allowing international observers from OSCE to be present, allows us, at least in EPP group, which I am a member of in European Parliament, we made very simple conclusion and statement that really to recognize those elections as legitimate ones would be a big mistake. So we shall see what will happen in other EU institutions. I hope that in the Parliament we shall continue discussions in the plenary, in committees, in delegations. So, and now, of course, for us it's very important to hear directly, from the people who know all the information on the ground, how they evaluate all the what was happening during the last days, during the voting days. I was impressed by the publications made by Sergei Shpilkin, whom perhaps a lot of people here knows as really election mathematical expert, on elections, who put very clear evidence that participation was only around 38% instead of officially declared 52%, and United Russia got only 31, in between of 31, 33% instead of 52%. So we see what kind of falsification perhaps was happening during the voting days. So, but I will not continue some technical details. So as I said, 1 hour of our conversation. So first of all, three experts will speak, then questions and answers. Questions should be put on chat, and here is, as I was informed, also Russian translation for those who would like to listen Russian version, but we shall speak, as usually, we shall use English language. So I would ask Vladimir Milov, to start, then Vladimir Kara-Murza, and we expect that Konstantin EGGERT will join us very soon. So please, up to 10 minutes.
I'm unmuting myself. Thank you so much. And I wanted to concentrate on the political consequences and political meaning of this election results, but I can't avoid mentioning the major fraud and falsifications that were involved this time to prop up results of the ruling party. First, I think is the biggest scandal of these elections is the so-called electronic voting in Moscow. It's almost 2 million votes were cast that way. And it's about up to 4% of the total number of votes cast in this election, which means that it significantly influenced an outcome. 15 Duma mandates were contested in Moscow, plus this has a very significant impact on party list voting. So we are talking about dozens of mandates actually influenced by electronic voting in Moscow. And important feature of this, you probably heard the story that in 12 out of 15 districts in Moscow, when ballots were counted on the ground in polling stations, United Russian administrative candidates have lost. But then the next day, the results of electronic votes came in, and they completely flipped that picture, meaning that in contrast to what was happening on the ground, electronic votes were overwhelmingly in favor of United Russia, which is simply not plausible and is very scandalous. The main problem, which was highlighted many times with this electronic voting system, is not even that it's not transparent and might involve some manipulation with the results. Is the fact that it's a very easy tool of psychological pressure on employees of state-controlled organizations and companies, which basically these 2 million electronic votes are essentially almost 90% of them are employees of different state-affiliated structures who were forced by their bosses to actually go and register for electronic voting. They have been told in big numbers that the government will be actually able to see how they voted, so that voting secret is not kept in this regard. And most of these people are obviously not technically proficient. They couldn't really tell whether it was true or not, and many of them really voted for United Russia not out of support but out of fear that they might face consequences at their job position if the bosses found out that they voted against the ruling party. So what is important about electronic voting is not the vote change component, but this psychological pressure component, which means that many of people in the opposition, just for this reason alone, call for a complete invalidation of the results of electronic voting. Even the Kremlin loyal pollster of Tsuom had admitted that 13% of employees of different Russian companies had admitted that they faced pressure from their bosses regarding how they voted in this election. So that's a very serious issue. There are many others. Mr. Kubilius mentioned Sergei Shpilkin. I strongly advise anybody to read his publications. He's a well-known electoral mathematician who have been analyzing the statistics from polling stations on the ground for many years, and he shows a very clear picture that results for United Russia obviously significantly improve when the turnout at polling stations gets closer to 100%, which means that they're all drawn up. In polling stations with very high turnout, results are obviously drawn up because Normally, you don't see more than 30% turnout at the majority of cases where real independent observers are present on the ground. So Shpilkin estimates the total amount of fraudulent votes for United Russia as 14 million out of 28 million total votes cast for this party, which means that half of the number that United Russia received at these elections, as the authorities say, was fraud. And without it, they would get less than 200 seats in 450-seat Duma, which means that they can't hope for even the majority, but they will just be a big faction, and that is it. But results on paper obviously are totally different. However, I have to say, still, they did not manage to reach over the 50% threshold on proportional party lists. They got slightly less than 50%, which is extremely psychologically important because, as many political analysts correctly point out, in Russia, elections are more or less a referendum, a plebiscite of trust towards the incumbent authorities. And in a referendum, less than 50% means no, which means that majority of people who voted, even under official fraudulent results, still, majority of people who voted under a proportional system voted for other parties against United Russia. That's very important because Vladimir Putin, in the road to 2024, where he wants to extend his presidential powers indefinitely, he wants to demonstrate the supremacy, that the majority of Russians support his party. And he was very strongly involved in the United Russia campaign. In June at the party congress, he personally nominated the top 5 candidates to lead the party list into the elections. Very remarkable feature, 4 of 5 of the leaders of United Russia party list after the election had refused to take a mandate, which means that even here there was fraud. People who topped the United Russia electoral list said that we're not taking the parliamentary seats. This was just a window dressing their presence. And also, you know that Putin paid 10,000 rubles to each pensioner a few weeks before the election, specifically, explicitly tying this to United Russia majority in the next Duma. So he was heavily involved in this campaign, but his party still was not able to get through 50% threshold, even given all the fraud. That's very psychologically important, and it shows that Putin has his strategic weaknesses, and there is a very strong protest movement, bottom-up protest movement, which is fed up with the system, fed up with Putin, and fed up with his government. Now, on the other hand, I have to say that honestly, we in the opposition are very disappointed with most of the results, because we hoped that in many cases opposition candidates will be able to beat United Russia, that we will have a sizable independent faction in the Duma, consisting of dozens of members of parliament who would not obey to Putin's rules, and that we will be able to lower United Russia result even further, maybe closer to 40% or even below, and that we will be able to achieve significant defeats of governors and United Russia representatives in the regions. Most of this hasn't happened, and we're not pleased with that. We really hoped for a better result. However, the good thing, which I want to conclude with, is that the protest movement at these elections was very visible. It strongly materialized, and essentially it was a very binary, very black and white picture in most cases. It was administrative candidates versus Navalny's smart voting candidates. They were absolutely different in different districts. There were communists, Yabloko, Spravedliva Россия, and others, but it was always a very tight rivalry between incumbent United Russia candidates and candidates supported by smart voting. So despite all the repression, despite Navalny being imprisoned and all, we still managed to assemble a very significant protest movement, bottom-up protest movement, which really fought with United Russia, and in many cases lost by a relatively small margins. Some of the smart voting candidates have actually won. So it means that we were still, despite all the bad news you heard during the past months, we still were able to assemble a very worthy and very capable protest movement. We're not happy that it did not achieve the results that we were looking for, but this mobilization can work. And we can further deliver significant blows to Putin's system during different political campaigns down the road. And it's also very clear that important feature, United Russia is not particularly celebrating this result. Even Dmitry Medvedev, party leader, did not arrive at the official celebration of the election victory, or so to say. So that's very important, because it was visible that the ruling party have lost organic support. They can only win through fraud. And the protest movement did not achieve the results it wanted, but it was very strong and was equally competing and losing only because of unprecedented fraud. That's shortly the outcome. We'll be happy to take questions, but once again, as in many cases with Russia, it's complicated. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Vladimir. And now I see Konstantin came, but we are turning to, first of all, to Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir, please, floor is yours, and your evaluations and thoughts of elections.
Thank you so much, Andrius, and I want to thank the Friends of the European Russia Forum for continuing this series of important conversations, and of course, this week focusing on the so-called election we had this past weekend. Vladimir MILOV just gave an excellent and an all-encompassing overview of all the problems with this exercise that we all witnessed. And we can speak for a long time about all the ways that this vote was manipulated, starting with the long lines of state employees and military conscripts to a 3-day vote with no control of what happens to the ballots over the first 2 nights, with this electronic voting, which was just a new know-how, frankly, because why bother with all of these tricks where you can get actually caught by observers and caught on camera when you can just invent 2 million votes out of nowhere and in a phantom way just switch the results, as happened in Moscow. There was, of course, also some plain old ballot stuffing. Many violations were recorded, and Golos, which is Russia's leading independent vote monitoring organizations, they already published a brief version of their report. They will be preparing a more comprehensive, more final version listing all of these violations. But frankly, I think it would be enough to say just one thing. In these last few days, I keep remembering this old, I don't know if it's a joke or if it's a real story, but this famous story of when, after losing a battle, in the War of 1812, Napoleon called his chief of artillery, and he asked him, "Why did our guns not fire?" And the chief of artillery said, "Well, Your Majesty, I have exactly 12 reasons. Number one, we ran out of gunpowder." And Napoleon said, "Okay, you can stop right there." I think it would be enough to say that the vast majority of strong potential opposition candidates were simply disqualified preemptively from taking part in this so-called election. A fundamental element of any election in any normal system is choice. And this was something that was fundamentally lacking in the so-called parliamentary election in Russia. There's a long list of prominent opposition politicians, prominent potential parliamentary candidates, starting, of course, with Alexei Navalny himself, who's in prison, but also anybody who is even remotely associated with him. Many other quasi-legal restrictions imposed by the Putin regime to keep people off the ballot. Golos, the same vote monitoring NGO, recently published a report which shocked even me and my colleagues who have long been participants of Russian political life. The Golos report showed that there are about 9 million people in Russia who are even formally prohibited from running for any elected office. The report was called Novые Lishenцы. Lishenцы, a term from the early Soviet years, when people who belong to the clergy, to the aristocracy, to the military brass, to the entrepreneurial class, were formally stripped of their electoral rights by the Bolshevik regime. They were called Lishenцы, and in 1927, there were about 3 million of them in the USSR. Well, today we have 9 million in Russia, according to Golos. And as I mentioned, a long list of politicians: Alexei Navalny, Dmitry Gudkov, Ilya Yashin, Yulia Galyamina, Lev Schlossberg, many others who were either preemptively disqualified from running or were taken off the ballot in the process during the campaign itself, as happened with Lev Schlossberg, who was finally disqualified by the Supreme Court of Russia only about 10 days or so before the election. So I think this is the central focus here. And when we're talking about this so-called election, the central element of this is the fact that most real opposition candidates could not even take part. But even though there was no possibility of an honest election in the first place because of this, we did not even have an honest vote count among those candidates who were allowed to run, as Vladimir was just describing. I always vote ever since I turned 18 and assumed the right to vote. I always voted in my local precinct, which is electoral precinct number 40 on Bolshaya Ardynka Street in Moscow. So Moskvarechye, this historic, picturesque district, just a few minutes walking distance from the Kremlin, Bolshaya Ardynka number 15. And this is where I voted again last Sunday. And I didn't just vote there, I also stayed to observe the vote count during the election night, because our precinct is, maybe it's old Muscovite pride, maybe it's the fact that there are several strong-minded independent electoral commission members in that precinct. But this particular precinct is known for producing and publishing honest voting results. For example, in the Moscow mayoral election in 2013, according to official figures of that precinct, Alexei Navalny won the Moscow mayoral election. And this has happened every time. And so it was interesting for me to, I decided to stay to observe the vote count just to have a small glimpse into what Russian voters actually think, into the real sentiments of Russian voters, even in the context of this unfair and unfree election in the first place, with most opposition candidates disqualified from the ballot. And so what I saw in front of my eyes, and I still have a copy of this officially certified protocol in my pocket. So the three top spots on the party list ballot were divided between the Communist Party, 27%, and it's unusual that there's such a high communist vote in Moscow. This is no doubt a bonus from the Smart Vote initiative that Vladimir was just describing. So the communists were first with 27%, United Russia was second with 20%, and Yabloko was close third with 19%. So those are the three top vote getters on the party list ballot. And then for the individual single-member district ballot, Sergei Mitrokhin, who's one of the leaders of Yabloko, who was also backed by the Smart Vote initiative, he won with 35% of the vote against just 14% for the mayor's candidate, the administrative candidate. So those were the actual voting results official voting results that I saw in front of my eyes, that I still have a copy of the protocol certified by the Electoral Commission in my pocket. When we all saw and heard the official results the next morning, it's as if it came from another country. I mean, obviously, the center of Moscow doesn't vote like the rest of the country. There are bound to be differences, but what we saw is, two different planets in terms of the official voting results. And what we saw is the party of Vladimir Putin, United Russia, which, according to even government pollsters from TSUOM, is down in the 20s in terms of its public support. Those were the figures published in early September. The Levada Center, which is the leading independent, actually the last remaining independent polling agency in Russia, was prohibited from publishing any polls during the campaign because they have been designated as a foreign agent by the Putin regime. So their last figures date from June, and their last figure was 27% for United Russia that they published. But even TSUOM, so the government-owned, the government-controlled polling agency, showed United Russia, I think it was 28% or something. So those were the same figures. And what we see is a party which is in the 20s in public opinion polls, getting a 2/3 supermajority in our so-called parliament. So these official tallies have nothing to do with reality, and needless to say, they do not reflect the actual public sentiments of Russian society. And this, to me, presents one major problem. I'm a historian by education, and the incontrovertible logic of history is that in those countries where governments cannot be changed at the ballot box, they are sooner or later changed on the streets. We have seen that in our own history. We have seen that in many other countries in our post-Soviet neighborhood. And this is where the current regime is leading us, because for the past 20 plus years now, the Kremlin has done everything to dismantle and destroy any opportunity for Russian citizens to be able to change the government at the ballot box. When we talk about elections in Russia, I think it's important to put things in context. The last time that we had a free and fair and democratic parliamentary elections in this country was in December of 1999. And this is not my opinion. These are the official reports from observers sent by the Council of Europe and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. If you go on the OSCE website, you will see all the observer mission reports published for the last 30 years. And the last time that they assessed a Russian parliamentary election as generally free, fair, and democratic was in December of 1999. By the way, this time, for the first time in 30 years, we did not have any OSCE observers coming here to watch our election, because the Russian authorities have put up restrictions that made it impossible for the OSCE to conduct its mission properly, of course, very hypocritically using COVID as a pretext. You know, there are only 3 places left here in Moscow that are apparently dangerous for COVID. You can go to cinemas, restaurants, theaters, festivals, book fairs, no problem. You know, the Moscow Book Fair is starting tomorrow. Everything is fine. 3 places that are dangerous for COVID. The courtrooms, if you're a journalist or an audience member, you cannot get access to a courtroom because of COVID. Of course, opposition rallies, God forbid, those are the most dangerous, you know, from the epidemiological point of view, because those are completely prohibited, even if you're just one person standing with a poster. And the third thing apparently is the OSCE observer mission, because they were not allowed to come in to observe the Duma election over the pretext of COVID. So this is where we are in terms of what happened last weekend. You know, get a lot of questions from journalists. So what is the strategy for the opposition going forward? Well, to be honest, nothing has changed, because our strategy was never, you know, centrally connected to these elections that are completely controlled by the regime. And, you know, Vladimir Putin is not going to leave power as a result of an election. I think that's just stating an obvious fact. Unlike back in 2011, when you recall we had mass protests on the streets of Moscow after a similarly fraudulent parliamentary election, this time the atmosphere here is very subdued. There are no major protests. There are a few gatherings here and there, but nothing comparable to what happened 10 years ago. But I think it's important to state that this silence, this respite, is both deceiving and temporary. Because if we look at the actual state of Russian public opinion, if we look at the growing, obvious fatigue of society, especially the younger part of society, with this stagnating one-man authoritarian rule that is now stretching into its 3rd decade, we see that something is brewing under this deceitful quietness. And I think the big date for this will be 2024, the date Vladimir also mentioned. It's, you know, Russian history is notoriously difficult to predict. Major political change in Russia is notoriously difficult to predict, as proven by previous instances of political upheaval in our country, 1905, 1917, 1991. Nobody predicted any of those, or Bolotnaya for that matter, in 2011 as well. But I think the most likely date that will focus this growing public restlessness, this growing public fatigue with this 2-decade-plus one-man rule will be 2024. And the reason that that date is important is because Vladimir Putin will no doubt attempt to extend his presidential mandate in violation of the constitutional term limit, which he unlawfully overturned last year during these so-called constitutional amendments passed under the cover of the pandemic. And what's important to me about 2024 is that that year, in a way, the regime will be crossing an important red line between illegitimacy de facto, which most of us think, you know, has happened a long time ago, and illegitimacy de jure. Because for a long time, for many years, Vladimir Putin, you know, he's been called the legalistic dictator. Vladimir Putin tried to pretend to observe the formal letter of the law, even when he violated the spirit. This happened, for example, when he put Dmitry Medvedev in his place as quote unquote president of Russia. You know, the man didn't have the power to appoint his own secretary, but on paper he was president. And so the term limits were not broken, and many other similar examples. With these constitutional amendments that Putin pushed through last year, he broke not just the spirit, but the letter of the Russian law in 3 different ways. First, by Russian law, you cannot pass constitutional amendments collectively. You have to do this individually according to substance. You cannot group 206 on pensions, healthcare, historical memory, and so on into one yes or no. This is what they did. Secondly, you cannot amend or change the meaning of the first 2 chapters of the Constitution, the fundamental chapters that outline the basic rights and freedoms. And they did do that on the sly, for example, by adding this new clause that the Russian government can ignore rulings by international court. We still have Chapter 1 of the Russian Constitution say that international law takes precedence over domestic law. So I don't know if there's another country in the world that has a constitution that contradicts itself in different articles, but this is what we have thanks to Vladimir Putin now. And thirdly, of course, this farcical plebiscite, which is what they call it, that took place last year, Andrius, as you mentioned in your introduction, completely outside both of Russian electoral legislation, also of our obligations under the OSCE Copenhagen document that governs the conduct of elections and referenda in OSCE member states. So for those three major reasons, those constitutional amendments that were passed in 2020 are legally speaking null and void. They were passed unlawfully. This was reflected in a landmark report earlier this year by the Council of Europe Venice Commission, also known as the European Commission for Democracy Through Law. This was very important, Andrius, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you for leading in this effort. This was also reflected in your Russia report that the European Parliament passed overwhelmingly by 75% of the vote just last week. And that now has official force as well. That's very clearly reflected there. When we saw some of the reactions to this so-called Duma election in the last few days, coming from your group in the European Parliament, the EPP group, also from the other side of the Atlantic, from the US Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a commission in the American Congress tasked with monitoring OSCE obligations. And by the way, I couldn't even open it here in Moscow because so many American websites are just blocked. So I had to ask friends to send me, screenshots so that I could actually see the statement because the link doesn't work. The key word on both of those statements on two sides of the Atlantic, both yours and the American one, it was legitimacy. That was the key word, the lack of legitimacy of these so-called elections that we saw last weekend. This is going to be the key word again for what's going to happen in 2024. Because if Putin crosses that red line, he's going to become an illegitimate usurper, not just de facto, but this time de jure, like Lukashenko, like Maduro in Venezuela, like Blaise Compaoré in Burkina Faso, like previously Fujimori in Peru, like all of these other dictators who have tried that previously. And so I think the year 2024 is going to be a major test, frankly, both for Russian society in terms of our society's tolerance or not tolerance for continued autocratic rule. But I think it's also going to be a major test for the Western world, a major test of the Western world's commitment to the rule of law, not only in words, but also in practice. Because the only possible response to this situation that I just described would be formal non-recognition by the European Union, by the West in general, of any attempt by Putin to unlawfully and illegally continue in power 1 minute beyond the end of his current and final mandate on the 7th of May, 2024. And I think it's very important to already start that conversation now. Thank you so much once again for this opportunity. And after Konstantin speaks, I look forward to any questions that our audience members may have.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vladimir. So, and now I would like really to ask Konstantin EGGERT, who is also very well known to our community, and Konstantin, your thoughts and your conclusions.
Thank you very much, Andrius. It's lovely to see everyone, and I'm really sorry I speak to you from a hotel, so the connection here is not great. I may disappear anytime, and I will have to run probably a few minutes earlier than our session ends. So, but I'm also ready for any questions after I speak. First of all, where I agree with Vladimir and Vladimir. First of all, what I do like is the fact that everything is called so-called. It is so-called. It is a so-called election. It is a so-called president. It is a so-called constitution. And frankly speaking, it is a so-called political parties that took part in this farce. These are not parties, including United Russia. These are all departments of the presidential administration that sit under different labels, if you wish. Secondly, where I agree with Vladimir Kara-Murza that 2024 will be a very important moment because by that time Putin will have to decide whether he stays on. Personally, I think he would like to stay on. And that will be also a test not only for the Russian society, but also for whatever remains, whatever, if you can call it that way, the Russian political class or Russian ruling class, whether they really want to stick with Putin for eternity. Essentially, he is now president for life. So 2024 really is a threshold. And in this respect, I think we'll see preparations, and I think that other colleagues may agree or disagree, but we already see attempts by Putin to show different people from his entourage, show them on television, show them in different circumstances as potential successors. It's the foreign intelligence chief Narishkin. It's especially, I think I would say, the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, who's been speaking about pretty much everything from development of Siberia to culture in the last few weeks on state propaganda or state propaganda television. So it seems that some kind of casting for potential successors is going on. How it will end, we don't know. Maybe just a put-up job by Putin to deflect attention. Now, what I think is important, and where I may disagree with Vladimir Kara-Murza and Vladimir Milov, is that this continuing to try to break this system through election will be in any way useful. I think that this lesson should be learned after this election. There is nothing new in what they did this year. Probably they did it in a very outrageous and open way, but elections were fraudulent starting from 2003, the parliamentary elections at least. So it's just the scale of falsifications, the audacity with which the regime delivered these blows, that was a bit surprising, but otherwise it's nothing new. I'm not hiding it. I was writing about it. I always defended a different strategy. I thought that active boycott of any electoral procedures will be the right attitude in these circumstances, because you don't play cards with the mafia. Essentially, if we say that these people are illegitimate, we have to show that they are illegitimate by not voting, actively encouraging others not to vote, and actively proclaiming that all this is a circus. Why we should give our votes to Zhirinovsky or to the communists who call the Kremlin to ask whether they want chicken or fish for their meal. I mean, I don't think that it works very well for Russian democracy. And actually, even if these people grab some votes, they will not share their newly found power, newly found authority with those who help them with smart voting or with some other electoral techniques, let's put it like that. But I don't want to dwell on the past. I think that looking forward, one important thing needs to be noted. Vladimir Kara-Murza already mentioned Levada Center, which is the only remaining independent polling authority in Russia. Their recent poll has shown figures which, to my mind, speak a lot about the trends in Russian society, to the extent you can believe polls in Russia, because many people will say that lots of people are basically very hypocritical in answering questions by posters. But this was a one-on-one poll; it wasn't a telephone poll, so maybe there is a grain of truth in it. There are two findings in it. One is, let us say, not very optimistic for Vladimir Putin. And the poll was conducted essentially, I think it was early August or late July. 2/3 of the polled said that they would prefer a normal, prosperous country where they can live, which they shouldn't leave, but which they don't want to leave, but where they want to stay and where they will live normally. Two, Russia being a great power and empire. So the question was formulated as, would you prefer basically a prosperous country, even if it's not a top power in the world, to being a top power, not having basically normal income, normal life? So 2/3 of the poll said they want prosperity, they want normal life. That means that yet another small victorious war in Ukraine, in inverted commas, quote unquote, may not work for Vladimir Putin, although it doesn't exclude that he will try. I actually think that he's not losing hope. But the second figure is more interesting. 50% of the poll, including 30% of those who are 18 to 24 years old of age, said that their preference is a Soviet system of distribution, state ownership, and generally, basically, bureaucratic socialism. So when people say they want a Soviet system, of course, none of them wants a gulag. But I do not think that this particular poll bodes well for the future of Russia, because first of all, the Kremlin will have a tool at its disposal to spook off, especially the big city populations, middle classes, by saying, well, if it's not for Putin, it will be some kind of crazy communist. And secondly, there is, of course, a demand for very significant redistribution in the society, and the fact that Russia doesn't have a normal social democratic party, and people just don't believe parties as such. It is a verifiable statistical fact. Means that there is a huge scale for demagoguery and kind of artificially simple solutions. And that is a sociological reality with which probably everyone will have to deal. By the way, also Putin will have to deal with it, not only the opposition. So my look at 2024 is such that, first of all, I think the opposition forces have to basically take a bit of a pause and take a very long and hard look at what kind of alternative the opposition can, maybe united opposition, can offer Russia and the Russian people. A vision for the future that will be detailed, but at the same time inspiring. I'm afraid that just saying, let's beat united Russia doesn't work. Number two, I think that the situation at the top will not be very beneficial for Putin, because there are lots of mid-level bureaucrats, mid-level civil servants, mid-level state company, state corporation functionaries who are, vice governors, vice presidents, vice ministers, that feel that with the people that sit on the top and who are intent to sit on the top, I mean, the Putin family, if you wish, that want to sit on the top forever, that doesn't give them the chance to try themselves at the very top. That may lead to disagreements and probably cleavages inside the ruling clique. I'm not saying they will happen, but I think that the longer Putin stays, the more they will happen. Question is how the opposition outside the Kremlin walls and outside the fake Duma can use these trends. And I think number three, what is important and what is, I think, quite dangerous, is that what polls say is one thing, but what Putin, Shoigu, and the rest of them think is another thing. And I may well imagine that the Kremlin may yet another time, in spite of all the data, try to launch yet another foreign policy adventure in hope that garrison of the besieged fortress Russia will once again rally to the flag. I think it's not tomorrow, although who knows. But I suppose that at the same time we're entering a very dangerous period in basically the international contact, in the international environment of Russia, because very soon we'll have Germany with a caretaker government for anything between, I don't know, a month and half a year. We'll have France completely consumed by its row with the United States and Australia, and later with presidential elections in which Mr. Putin's friend Marine Le Pen will run quite a bit of a chance to at least put a big resistance against Emmanuel Macron. And of course, we have the United States, which is very much parked the Russia issue, I mean the administration, not so much Congress, and switch to China. I don't mean that they don't pay attention, but I think the perception in Washington is that Putin is not doing something that warrants very urgent attention. There is the fallout from the Afghanistan fiasco. There is China, which is going to be a big problem for the next century. So we all know that Putin is counterintuitive and sometimes kind of thinks that he can surprise everyone. So I wouldn't be surprised if the next year brings some kind of provocation, let's put it like that, including maybe on NATO border. And the fact that I'm speaking to you from Kaunas in Lithuania, Lithuania's second capital, and only 100 kilometers from me, there is still a crisis. There is still a Cold War waged by Putin and Lukashenko. Don't forget it, it's not only Lukashenko, but waged by Putin and Lukashenko against the European Union and NATO, with the migrants that are being lured, innocent people being lured to cross the border illegally into the European Union. That gives you a kind of idea of what kind of provocation can be contemplated in order to tickle the West and in order to wrangle concessions from the ever disunited European Union and America that is distracted. But I would say more and more European, more or less, mostly European Union. So I think one has to be vigilant, and one has to look forward to basically creating a viable strategy for Russia, inside Russia, but also essentially putting everything that happens in Russia in international context, which Putin, as we know, likes to use. And this fact we shouldn't forget. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Konstantin. And I think that three of you, gave quite a lot of, material for your internal discussion. Even, there is no need for a lot of questions. You can perhaps discuss with all your arguments. How you see the future and what should be the tactics or strategy of opposition. But I would like to put one question and or two questions, and one will coincide, which with a question which we got on Q&A. My first question would be very simple. So, in your opinion, if you can, you spoke maybe about that, but short, conclusion. So, what conclusion from those elections made Vladimir Putin? Does he consider that he won elections, or really he got a message that things are not so good, despite the fact what numbers they wrote? And second question, can you compare, Russia development and those elections, and also recent Belarusian development? Okay, I understand that this is not maybe not in detail, but Lukashenko also, he wrote the numbers which you wanted, but the outcome was that he lost legitimacy really among Belarusian people. So I mean, and that is why I could discuss with Konstantin, about boycott or not boycott. Belarusians were not boycotting elections. Lukashenko have stolen the election result, but there is really big impact of those elections, on the whole situation and developments in Belarus. Not really in changing, who is who, and who is ruling, but how the changes are really, maturing in Belarus. And here is a question from Arsen Bilalov. I will read it, very shortly. And it sounds like that. The electoral process based on manipulation, intimidation, and apathy of the general population is an imitation. Don't you think that a stolen victory has limited value, and this does not bode well for the future? And we will slide faster and faster to the Belarusian version. Belarusian version, I don't know of what, of regime or of the whole situation, but this parallel, Russia of today and Belarus is is coming to from different angles, to our mind. So I don't know who will start. Konstantin, you just finished, but if you can stay for a few minutes, you said that you maybe will need to run away, but I will ask maybe Vladimir Kara-Murza can a little bit elaborate. So what conclusions Vladimir Putin made, and what is the difference in between Belarus and Russian developments?
Thank you, Andrius. Thank you for those questions. We have long been in Belarus. When Putin only came to power 22 years ago now, and began to do many of the same things that Lukashenko had already been doing in Belarus, because of course he had a 6 years head start on Putin. Boris Nemtsov called this process Lukashizatsiya России, the Lukashization of Russia. And it's frightening, even if you look at the timeline, even the steps that those two dictators took would mirror each other. Just like Lukashenko, Putin began, with going after the independent media, then he would go after political opponents, then he would go against parliament as an institution and just completely hollow out elections to make them the meaningless exercises that we see today. And this parallel even reached the assassinations of key opponents of the regime. Lukashenko's key opponents had been murdered back in 1999. Zakharenko, the former Interior Minister, Gonchar, the former head of the Central Electoral Commission, and others. We had, as you know well, 6 years ago, Boris Nemtsov, the leading political opponent of this regime, was gunned down literally in front of the Kremlin walls in Moscow. So we have been living in the system for years. And, it really irks me when I hear sometimes people in the West continue to call Lukashenko the last dictator in Europe. I was a few months ago, I was visiting Vilnius, and I had a meeting with the foreign minister of Lithuania, and he has a big National Geographic map of Europe on his wall. And I commented that I wish Western European politicians had that same map as well, because that massive big part on the right side of Europe, that's called Russia. And people who call Lukashenko the last dictator in Europe, either they've missed their geography classes or they think Vladimir Putin is a Democrat. Because we have two last dictatorships in Europe, unfortunately, and everything that's happening here has been mirroring in a way what Lukashenko had already been doing previously. But to your question, Andrius, about the analogy was what was happening in Belarus last summer, the mass protests. I think that analogy is with 2024, something we've already been discussing during this conversation. I think the reason Putin was so frightened by the protests in Belarus last year, not so much because he was worried about Lukashenko, not because of the prospect of a loss of a reliable ally, maybe one of the last few allies he still has in the world. But I think mostly he was worried that he was looking into his own future, and that to him, it was a glimpse of what could well and may well, and I think even likely will happen in Russia in 2024. This is why he spared no expense to help Lukashenko maintain his control last year. So I think that's the analogy that comes to mind most of all when we speak about this. And again, for all of those reasons that we already discussed, that the year 2024 will mark the final loss of even the last remaining whatever shreds of legitimacy that this regime in the minds of some people may still have. Not in my mind, not I'm sure in the mind of Vladimir MILOV, but some people can still always say that, but formally speaking, Putin has ticked all the boxes. He had followed all the rules. He hasn't broken the letter of the law, even if he's broken the spirit. In 2024, this will all end. And this will be the final point of the loss of any remaining shreds of legitimacy of the Putin regime. And as I already mentioned, this will be an important test, both for us here in Russia, a test for Russian society and how Russian society will react to this illegitimate usurpation of power. But this will also be an important test for Western democracies of whether or not they will be prepared to accept that illegitimate usurpation. And so once again, I want to thank Andrius, your group, and all of your colleagues from different groups who have joined together last week to pass overwhelmingly this Russia report that raises this problem of 2024 and strongly hints at that potential non-recognition of Putin's usurpation of power.
Well, thanks a lot, Vladimir. Dear colleagues, I see that our time is running out, so I will add one additional comment or question, and those would be, your final comments, both for Konstantin and for Vladimir Milov. Maybe Konstantin, if you are, still available, you should be fast to answer. But it's again the same 2024. And question comes from Richard Hoogland, and the question sounds like that. Why do you think that Russians will change the regime in the street? Even in 1991, the regime was not changed in the street. The only big street protests at that time happened in Lithuania, Latvia, Georgia, etc. The Soviet Union changed to a Russian Federation within the Kremlin. It is not possible this will happen earlier than a street revolution and a storm of the Kremlin. I mean that everything will change. The changes will come not even in 2024, maybe before, but changes will happen with decision of Kremlin, not by pressure from direct pressure from public. So, but it's again question, what conclusions Kremlin is making from those elections, what are their forecasts, and so you should elaborate some predictions and forecasts. Konstantin, please.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Yeah, I really have to dash. To your first question, what Putin concluded from it. Look, if I had the powers to know what Putin thinks, or anyone thinks, I'd be a very successful, stock market player, and I would have been very rich. I'm not, so I don't think we know. But what we can say is that probably he'll be looking for some kind of unexpected turn, because of course his popularity is dropping, and I think it's a function of him being around for such a long time. He doesn't need to do anything to get on the nerves of people by just the mere fact of him being present. His and the regime's main tools of basically maintaining control, apart from violence and psychological pressure, are essentially keeping the check-in desks at major airports open. So whoever wants to leave, please, you're most welcome. So all the smarties will go anywhere from Vilnius to Santiago de Chile and write their opposition blogs there. And secondly, I think another thing is that it's still a regime that sells oil, gas, gold, precious metals. So they can always try and buy loyalty, at least try. I'm not saying that loyalty is always buyable, but they can try. So that's their, I think, perception of what they can do. Remember, they are not strategic thinkers. They always think maximum 2, maximum 3 years in such circumstances ahead, like to 2024. I do agree with Vladimir Kara-Murza that external pressure is very important, and Putin reacts to it, and he reacts in different way, but he reacts. However, I'm not certain that, for example, major European Union countries will not recognize the results of this election. Actually, I'm very pessimistic about it. There are 2 Europes. One Europe which starts in Kana in Lithuania and ends at Poznan. Another one starts at the Oder and goes all the way west to Lisbon. They have 2 different views of Putin and Russia, and there's a lot of vested interest. Just look at Nord Stream 2, and I think that because of that, there's not going to be a united European rejection of this. That's my opinion. I may be wrong. I actually hope I will be wrong. But we have to be realists in this respect. There is a big hope for what the Congress now started, the sanctions, with the Navalny list and things like that. Let's see. Putin's sun always rises and sets in Washington, D.C. He's obsessed with the United States. But I would say that definitely 2024 is a time to offer a very new vision, and whether it's Belarus or not. Look, Belarus is different. Belarus is not an empire that's wounded in its pride. It's essentially mono-ethnical, and the comparison of the boycott comparison, I think it doesn't work this time, because in the case of Lukashenko, there was a very, very clear united opposition candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. It wasn't puppets like Zhirinovsky and Prilepin and the rest of them. parliamentary elections are different. And actually, I want to remind you that 2018, Alexei Navalny called for the boycott of presidential elections. I think that I don't want to discuss sometimes election strategies work, sometimes boycotts work. It depends. I think that there needs to be, of course, a very clear, there are several things that we know people can do. Certainly Eastern Europe and the Baltics can continue to press for a certain line against the Kremlin, as they did with the failed summit, which Merkel and Macron called for in June, immediately after the Russian-American summit. And I think there needs to be new ways of describing the illegitimacy of the authorities in Russia and of the whole system, not only authority, the whole system that they created. The fake opposition, the fake new quote-unquote liberal party, which is now going to be presented to our German and French friends as, you know, new faces of Russian politics, new representatives of city middle classes, stuff like that. So, I mean, we just need to continue. People who always saw through that need to continue doing what they did. But I think that strategizing for 2024 is very important. Here I agree with both Vladimirs. I really have to dash. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Konstantin. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks. Yeah, bye. See you later. So, Vladimir Milov, your concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And first, on this question about what happened in Russia in 1991, I think our viewer has absolutely wrong perception about what was going on there. Street demonstrations were hugely involved in changes in Russia. At the moment, we had like near 1 million demonstrations on Manezhne. These pictures are widely circulating over the internet. And we also came, I think the biggest rally was in support of fight of Lithuania for independence. And I was participating in there 30 years ago.
And I was too. I'm still here.
We went under slogans, Bolsheviks, hands off Lithuania, and I think it worked very well. So importantly, I think coming back to this question of shall we or shall we not participate in the elections as opposition tactics, we've tried boycotts as well. However, I have to say that we don't have perfect options in Russian politics. All our options are 100% imperfect. So we have to maneuver through a very difficult, very tightly controlled authoritarian reality. And there's one thing which defines it all, I think. Elections is a very, very rare event where the government actually approaches Russian people and asks them something. Usually it doesn't happen this way. It happens vice versa. The government dictates people what to do. Elections is a very rare and probably the only event where they ask for people's opinion, and we get approached by our supporters on the grassroots level asking, listen, we now have not really a choice. Of course, it's a false choice, but they are asking us something, we should somehow respond. What shall we do? So that's an opportunity that we simply can't afford to miss. And we discussed this at length with Alexei Navalny. You know, one thing he told me, he said, I feel myself that the authorities, Putin, they experience such a great stress whenever elections are approaching. So we simply can't afford to discard it and not use this opportunity to do them harm, you know. This is why, with all the imperfections, we still have to keep trying to use this as a way of communicating with people. Andrius, back to your question. No, it's not that we don't know. We do know something. I'm a former bureaucrat and I have a lot of people there in the government. Their major conclusion after these events is that they feel like they have a proof now that they have lost support on the ground. They can only use fear, repression, and fraud as a means of holding on to power. This is actually very similar not only to Lukashenko, but all the outdated autocratic regimes like Maduro, Assad, Putin, and Lukashenko are, you know, they're just names on this list of bad guys who have chosen to hold on to power through extreme, brutal repression. Elections no longer work because people turned against them. They clearly understand it. That's Putin's conclusion from this. So I want to conclude with actually a trying to predict the future developments, I want to conclude with some shot of optimism, because the rephrasing Lincoln or whoever said that, I mean, you can terrorize many people for some time. You can terrorize some of the people all of the time, but you cannot hold on to power by terrorizing all the people all the time. Lukashenko is only surviving through extreme brutality against his people. So we clearly see that Putin learns this lesson and turning the same road. This will not last forever. We actually, what began with this last weekend vote is beginning of a countdown of end for Putin, because it's visible that organic support for him is gone. He can only survive through repression and fraud. It's bad news in the short while, but good news in the longer run, because he will not be able to maintain the power forever through brutal repression.
Andrius, if I may add just a couple of concluding words before we all disconnect. Thank you to my good friend Richard Hoagland from the Netherlands for that question. But I just want to back up what Vladimir just said. Change in 1991 came from the streets. It did not come from the Kremlin. The people in the Kremlin, Yanayev, Yazov, Krychkov, Pavlov, and others, they were behind that coup d'etat in August 1991 to try to go back to the bad old ways and to cement Soviet control. These people had everything at their disposal, from the government apparatus to the party machine, to the police, the military, all the propaganda outlets. Of course, they had the tanks, which they sent to the streets of Moscow. And it was Russian citizens, the hundreds of thousands of people who went to the streets and stood in front of those tanks in August 1991, who prevailed and who made Soviet regime collapse. So we have seen in Russia many times change come through the streets. This was the most dramatic one. And again, this speaking as a historian, not as a politician, in those systems where governments cannot be changed at the ballot box, they sooner or later will be changed in the streets. And I think this is the direction that we are heading towards here in Russia. Thank you so much once again, Andrius, and to all colleagues on this panel, and to the Friends of European Russia Forum for hosting this conversation.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, both Vladimir, and of course, thanks a lot to Konstantin, who left us earlier. Really, I think it was very needed conversation about what has happened during this weekend with so-called elections. At least for me, evidence is very clear. Kremlin is really very much afraid of people, of Russian people, and that is why they behave in such a brutal way. Before, this weekend, with the arrest of Navalny, with all of foreign agents and so on, and all those manipulations, and really stealing the votes in Moscow and so on. It's showing really the size of that fear in Kremlin. Now, of course, we shall raise the questions about legitimacy of Duma in our institutions, in EU institutions. That will be also some kind of test for the Western community, what conclusions they will make, and at least in my view, the best service to the future of Russia, of democracy in Russia, which West can give, at this moment, to speak very, very clearly, that what had happened here, in Russia during this weekend, it cannot be called elections. That's the fact. What impact it will have on 2024, we shall see. But I agree that really messages which Russian people were sending, during all that period of time, before elections and during elections, I think those were very serious messages to Kremlin. It cannot continue in the same way as it is now. So, dear colleagues, thanks a lot to everybody for this late evening conversation. Good luck to everybody, and see you later in another seminar. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Andrius.
Bye. Bye.